I mean, unfortunately, the prophets are a lot of, hey, there's judgment coming.
You better watch out,
Right.
Israel. That's coming at you.
So good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Welcome back to Hosea. We're in chapter 8 this week. Last time we covered chapter 7. Hosea once again spoke of healing God's people, but like a good physician, his first you'd have to diagnose the problem, gets them to see their condition so that it can be addressed. Part of their problem is their rulers, which are full of jealousy and anger and envy that is compared to a hot oven. It's smoldering inside of them in secret. But in the morning, when the doors of the oven are opened, it's compared to a raging fire that consumes everything. Israel is also compared to a silly bird that flitters back and forth between things, can't make a decision. And what's worse is that the two things that Israel is trying to decide between, going back and forth, are both going to destroy her. So it's rather than being indecisive and trying to go back and forth between two nations that want her destruction, she is urged to come back to who made them strong in the first place, the one who had rescued them before, rather than align with those who would seek her destruction. So, getting into chapter 8, can we have somebody read verses 1 through 6?
Set the trumpet.
No, go ahead.
Set the trumpet to your lips. One like a vulture is over the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law. To me they cry, my God, we, Israel, know you. Israel has spurned the good. The enemy shall pursue him. They made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. With their silver and gold they made idols for their own destruction. How far am I reading?
To verse 6.
I have spurned your calf, O Samaria. My anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of innocence? For it is from Israel, a craftsman made it. It is not God. The calf of Samaria shall be broken to pieces.
Okay. So, biblical scholars seem to set the setting for this prophecy to be somewhere around 733 BC. This is towards the end of that period of instability after the rebellion of Pekah. This is very close to the point at which Assyria comes and conquers Israel. Hosea is being told to pick up his trumpet and sound it aloud. This trumpet ought to remind us back at earlier chapters, which prophesies a war trumpet being sounded as a sign of judgment against the northern kingdom. And the reason for the sounding of the trumpet is there is a vulture flying overhead. Now, we looked at before in Luke, where, obviously in this kind of what you see on the side of the road a lot of the times, you see a vulture, something dead is nearby. It was actually kind of surprising the other day, Jen and I leaving the house, there was like 16 of them flying in the air, just all circling, just right in the middle of town. I'm like,
That's so crazy.
yeah, you would expect that out in the field somewhere where maybe like a deer died or maybe even a cattle or something, but in the middle of town, it's like, man, what's big enough to attract 16 vultures in the middle of town? We have from Luke chapter 17 the words of Jesus, where the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. This is a sign of death. And you could really consider the whole of Israel at this point as one big corpse. There's nothing about them that's living, at least not in any spiritual or eternal sense. So the presence of this vulture proclaims the deadness of their condition spiritually. And Hosea once again reminds them that they have transgressed the covenant that they had with the Lord. The very first commandment being that the Lord is their God and they shall have no other gods before him. They were only supposed to have one God. And obviously they have many, many more than that at this point. But the revolt didn't stop at just the one commandment, but their other transgressions kind of spill out from this first one. Martin Luther, in his small catechism, has a kind of similar thought here, that really there's only one commandment, the first commandment, and the other commandments are elaborations or expressions of that commandment of you shall have no other gods before me. This is, when in the small catechism it answers, what does this commandment mean? Luther always starts with, we should fear, trust, and love God by, and then explaining whichever particular commandment it is. But all of that is like, well, you have no other gods by fearing, loving, honoring God. And that means in this particular case, you don't steal, you protect people's property, you all these other things. So out of the one transgression, having the multiple gods, all of the other laws of gods are broken because, well, you don't know God, you don't know what he wants. So sometimes people treat the faith like it's about holding the right opinions. Like if you say the right things, then you're covered, and what you do doesn't matter so much. People think, or some people think, that they're Christians because they assent to a certain set of propositions. This, however, is very spiritually deadly, a way to think. The Northern Kingdom has kept their identity with Yahweh. They really do identify as, oh, we are Yahweh's people. Even though they did not feel like they had to listen to him or obey him, they still had this idea of this specialness, closeness with Yahweh, just by virtue of being, the Hebrew nation. That's not how things work, as we see going here into verse 2. So they delude themselves into thinking that they know God, and they are called by his name, and they even use his name, referring to the golden calves that they set up at Dan and Bethel. But they're making all of these sacrifices, which God doesn't call for, and they're sacrificing them to idols that God never said to build. They're completely ignoring what God has told them to do, the very words of God. And so it doesn't really seem like, for all of their special identity with God, they don't seem to know him that well. If Israel did know God, his holiness in particular, that would cause them to really take a second look at how they've been behaving, and probably to cause them to tremble when they realize just how they have been treating his commandments. We have from St. Jerome. This is just kind of a summary of what Jerome said. He heard this cry of, my God, we Israel know you. Rather than in the sounding of the trumpet before the war starts, Jerome kind of hears this as coming after the judgment has already arrived. And this is a cry of, as they're being led into captivity, but we can't go into captivity. We're God's people. It's like God, like, why aren't you doing anything to stop this? It's one of those cases where, or at least in Jerome's opinion, it's you forget about your identity as the people of God until suddenly it becomes important. It's like, oh, wait, we're the people of God. How are we being led into captivity? He's supposed to save us from stuff like this when you've never used his name before in your life up to that point. So their cry of "We're your people. How can this happen to us?" Like, well, you haven't been acting like his people up to this point. You haven't been concerned with what God wants. You haven't been listening to him, and it's obvious you have because he warned you ahead of time. And this was avoidable. You could, return and repent.
I'm sure Hosea wasn't a very popular guy at this point.
I don't think any of the prophets were popular.
No.
So, but instead they spurned the good, and as we know from Luke, when he was asked, "Good teacher," he says, "No one is good except God." So, by spurning the good, they spurned God Himself. And sin, in general, is a turning away from God and the good that He proclaims, and that leads them then into false worship. So he says that the enemy shall pursue him. The result of turning away from God is that you are left among those who would destroy you, without protection and with with your backs to those who really want to destroy you. Saint Jerome, once again, in the immediate connotation, is that Assyria will pursue them, but there's also the sense that Assyria is standing in the place of Satan and the demons right here, and that the enemy, the true enemy of Israel, will pursue them from their turning away from God. And once again, as Hosea previously compared their transgression to that of Adam, when they turned away from God, God told the enemy of mankind. I thought this was so interesting. He told the serpent, "You will eat dust." And then he turned to Adam and said, "And you are dust." And we just celebrated Ash Wednesday this week, where we're told, "As dust you are, and to dust you shall return." So we are, since the fall, we became serpent food, essentially. Apart from God, we are, left for demons and Satan to, destroy us, which is why we need God so much. When we depart from the safety of the Lord, that's where we're left. We're left as dirt to be eaten by demons. So we ought to avoid that. So we ought to turn to God. We ought to go to Him for which there's safety and who makes us more than dirt. He's the one who makes us into living creatures and gives us life eternal. But again, in the case of Israel here, they want to do things their own way rather than consulting God. And once again, referencing this rebellion of Pekah, they don't care about who God thinks should be king. They don't care about what God thinks about their rulers. They believe that they can establish a kingdom for themselves. The instability that came afterwards is from their attempt to make kings without consulting God. And obviously, because of that, because they think it's their power that makes kings, there was murdering and backstabbing and plotting, and there was obviously no prayer for consultation with what God would have them do or who their king ought to be. And it didn't stop there. They took the silver and gold, the prosperity that has been granted to them, these things that we've talked about previously are meant to be used in the worship of God and furthering His purpose. Well, they have devised their own purpose for them. They made idols out of them. So we have from Psalm 115, their idols are gold and silver, their work of the work of human hands. They have mouths but do not speak, eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear, noses but do not smell. They have hands but do not feel, feet but do not walk, and they do not make a sound in their throat. Those who make them become like them, so do all who trust in them. That's Psalm 115, verses 4 through 8. Have you ever thought about the idea that you become like what you worship?
And you almost,
Mhm.
and then you constantly want more and more.
Mm.
You feed into it.
Yep.
I think the one thing that saved me was my baptism. I believe that because I pursued things that were so far. Yeah, I mean, it did. I really believe that. A lot of my friends died in the midst of all that, and I didn't. I thank the good Lord that I didn't. But I really believe that I was baptized, and I used to cry out to God. I didn't know Him. I used to cry out to Him. I'm hurt. I'm suffering. He heard me, and He waited. In my sense, a long time, but it's like it's kind of like I've always been here with you,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll bring you back. So that's how it was for me.
Go ahead.
Well, he's talking about the idols saying like they're like it's a calf, but it has feet, but it can't walk,
Right.
and stuff. And that like, yeah, these things that we like want or worship or like money, they're not living. They're not, and like our God is a being, and like He gave us life, and these things give us nothing.
Mm-hmm. There was I don't remember who it was now. He was going through Egypt, and he noticed that in a lot of their iconography, one of their gods is essentially a dung beetle. You know, I think it's a dung beetle that moves the sun across the sky or something like that. And then you notice how just everywhere you went, there was just trash. Just how like they treated their cities like trash. And it's like, well, you know, if what you worship, if what moves the sky is a dung beetle, you know, you're there's going to be a lot of trash around, perhaps. Uh, and so there's this idea that because these idols are things that we create, it is our desires and our fallibility that are put into them. It's why the Greeks, their gods were so human-like, with all their pettiness and their squabbles and their wars and stuff like that. It's the Greeks putting themselves into these gods, so it justifies their own desires, and therefore they just, as you said, that feedback loop. It just goes right back into it, and they become more and more like these petty gods that they worship.
And so many, like even in the Hindus culture,
Mhm.
like so like it's a specific, like this god just does fertility, so but because I want to be fertile or have a child, like that's the only thing I deal with and stuff. Like they're so specific to
Right.
like what it is you want, so you make a god that gives you that.
Right.
That's convenient.
I saw something about it was in the Hindu culture society. They had like a grotto or something, and they there was thousands of different gods, and each person would go and they pray to whatever god it was, and they would just pray and pray and pray, and then basically nothing ever happened. And then I don't know, they're surrounding this whole area, and it's like they just keep asking for things, and it's not happening for them.
I don't know if you saw that. I think this was back in 2016, but there was a Hindu in India who made a Trump idol,
Oh,
and so that was it was really weird. So now there's a
That's very
Yeah.
that's very odd.
so.
Oh, man.
Have you thought about then in Christianity we're supposed to worship Christianity, Jesus Christ, and about how we're supposed to become more and more like Him. And the thought is, this how someone who worships God should behave?
Because we all fail. I mean, really, it's so easy to, you're going about your life and all of a sudden you realize, oh my, what am I doing?
Yeah.
I fall into that a lot.
So, in the same way, then, that Israel has spurned God, God is now saying, when we're down to verse 5, well, now God is spurning their idols. He's saying, oh, these things that you call by my name, it's like, I'm turning my back on them. I'm not hearing the worship or the prayers that you send towards them. He wants nothing to do with their false worship. It's like they can claim identity with him. They can claim their idols represent him, but he is firm that he's not having any part of it. In fact, his anger burns against them as a result of this. Do you see this sort of thing happening in our day? People who try and identify with God in ways that he would have nothing to do with.
Absolutely. You look at Kenneth Copeland. It's just he needs people to fund his church so he can buy a new plane. He's
Right,
got
yeah.
5 jets that he can. I mean, it's the gospel prosperity, Joel Osteen, all these people.
Well, it's any pastor, preacher, anyone that almost like wants to fill their seats with people by telling them what they want to hear versus what's actually in the Bible, and going against things that are actually said, like saying like even like the LGBTQ and stuff like that, like not saying they can't come to church and like condemn, but saying no, that's not a sin, because we know that it's a sin,
Right.
But we don't have to judge them or be a certain way towards them, but not saying no, your sin's fine. Like, and they just want to fill their seats with people and make like church like of the world instead of the word.
Yep. There's there's a lot of different levels that this can apply to. You have the false preachers are saying, oh no, God didn't really mean it.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also those who, like Israel, they say this thing and this way that we're worshiping is actually worshiping God when it has nothing to do with it. In particular, the Mormons are rather insistent that they're Christian, and yet insistent that the rest of Christianity is, wrong and a false, religion. And you see the way they worship and what they worship and how different it is from the Bible. And that's one of those situations where they may cry, aren't we your people? And it's like, you've turned your back on the Bible. You've turned your back on God. You've invented your own representation. You may call it by my name, but I've spurned this. So, there's a lot of different ways in which people try and claim identity with God and yet miss the whole point.
Yeah, I was in Colorado. I was at a supermarket late, like 10 o'clock, and the 2 guys in suits came up to me, and they were, Mormons.
Oh, the missionary, yeah.
And so they were, let's listen to them, and they said, well, we have a new Bible. And I said, oh, a new Bible. Okay, that's interesting. I said, because the Bible that I read has everything in it from the beginning to the end. So I don't think there's another need for another Bible because it's not real. And they were telling me all about stuff. I said, yeah, but this Bible is based on a race of people that never existed in America. It's not real. It's false. And of course, they were. They gave me a Book of Mormon. I said, okay, I'll take it and read it. And I read it. It's like, yeah, this is
It's not very interesting.
No.
It's some of it's just downright bizarre, and the
Yeah.
rest of it is just plagiarized from Isaiah.
Yeah, right. It's a trip. I did read it though. It's like, wow, that's not good.
So God asks Israel, it's like, how long will they be incapable of innocence? Or your translation may also have incapable of purity. He's not asking them to be completely innocent or pure. Uh, they aren't capable of that, even if they started out that way, and certainly not after they've, tainted themselves with idolatry and all the adultery and all the other things that they've done. Uh, it would be very hard to claim, oh yes, I'm innocent, and yes, I'm pure. Yet, what is it that true worship is supposed to do? It's supposed to transfer to us God's purity. It's worship isn't so much something that we give God, it's something that God uses to purify us. If they would leave their false gods and turn back to the true God and to true worship, they would receive God's purity. They would be capable of innocence. Um, they could live with God without being destroyed by the mere presence of his holiness. So this cry of how long will they be incapable of innocence is another cry of how long will it take for you to return to me? Purity and innocence is what God wants to give us. But it's not going to be in ways that we devise. We can't invent ways for God to, give us the things that he wishes to give us. It's going to be under terms by which he has set the ground rules. Excuse me. So God appoints the means by which we receive God's gifts. You had in the Levitical covenant, it was with the sacrifices, the doves or the lamb or whatever else was necessary. In the new covenant, we have baptism, we have the preaching of the word, we have absolution, and we have the Eucharist. In all of these things, God promises to deliver to us the forgiveness of sins. And righteousness and the righteousness of faith, which indeed deliver us and make us pure before him. Our own inventions, any other thing that we might invent as a sacrament, whatever sort of other thing we might come up with, could never accomplish such a thing. So these idols that God sees in Israel, he says that it's these things that they've made, they're from Israel. They have their origin in the people. It's their own invention. It's not a word from God. It does not have its origin with God, and he made no commandment to make such idols. It says a craftsman made it. It was made by human hands. It wasn't made from God, so it could not be from God. What can it do for the people who made it if its existence is owed by just a sinful man? God is saying that it's really very silly that we should look to something we created and call it as if it were above us and have knowledge greater than us. An interesting thing about altars in the Old Testament, at least the ones that God commands Israel to make, they were typically made with unhewn stones. They were just stones stacked up in a pile somewhere. The idea being that, well, these are stones that God made through, geological formation, anything, whatever. It's these stones exist in their form that they currently do because of God. It's not because man has added anything to it. So if you're going to offer sacrifices, it's going to be what God is doing and by what God has given you, not you haven't contributed at all to the sacrifice. And so God tells them their calves shall be broken to pieces. These calves that they've erected are going to have a very similar a fate to the golden calf before Mount Sinai. That one, too, was broken into pieces, and it was even ground into dust. So it was utterly destroyed. And Isaiah, who's preaching along about the same time, is the whole book is just full of examples of how foolish idolatry is. Saint Jerome has he translated this into the Latin Vulgate, and he has a very interesting translation for broken into pieces. He renders it into turn to spider's webs, and it has this commentary. Finally, as the filaments of spiders are dissolved into the wind, so will the calf of Samaria be reduced to nothing. God casts off the calves of the heretics of Samaria, who say they hold to the precepts of the law, who hold fast to the calf of clay, and work in the realm of the earth, and not the spirit, and do not raise their eyes to the heavens. We have any other questions or comments on this first section?
It sounds dire. And he's telling these people this stuff, and so many times God does things for them. And it's always been that way, the punishment, and then it's like they keep making the same mistake over and over again. And it's just the living God, and they turn to, we all do this, but how can they, so many examples of him fighting their battles, giving them everything, and they just don't, I guess they just make these idols out of stupid.
Well, so they were trying very hard to be like the nations around them. So there's a lot. You can, in a sense, you could say peer pressure. It's like you have all these big, powerful nations, or you have, at least at the time that the book started, they had a lot of prosperity and a lot of reach of their own.
Right.
So why do they need to look for a God to save them?
Right.
It's not until after the fact that a lot of times people say, "Oh, well, where was God? Why didn't He rescue me?" Not realizing that, well, you've kind of put yourself into that situation. Like He's been calling to you this whole time, and you could have repented at any point. And it's only when you've gotten yourself into a hole that now it is, God, why won't you save me?
Life's going good, so
So
I'm doing great.
We talked previously about our amnesia of God, how we just don't think about God through most of the day, or at least most of us do. And I'm sure there's plenty of people out there who, they're just thinking about God constantly. But that's a very determined way of living, that you're always having that before your mind.
It's always when something goes bad. How could you let this happen?
Yeah.
Why me? But it really is because, because you were looking over here because everything was going great.
Yeah.
We forgot to remember you. And I thought it was interesting too about you said, that the idols that they made them. So of course, they're with their hands, and God didn't give it to them. But even with our offerings that we give, it's here, I give this to you, and God's I give that to you first. Everything. Everything really does come from Him.
Yeah.
And it's not like we're giving it. It's like we're just giving it back.
Well,
Thank you for this. Yeah. And now
we've in the past couple of weeks we've talked a lot about how look, the sacrifices that you think that you're not buying a particular response. This isn't a slot machine or a vending machine. You put in this offering, you get this thing back from it, because as you said, you're only giving to God what He's already first giving you. So that God doesn't need the offering in the sense that He's going to be somehow worse off without it.
Yes.
The purpose of it is to get us cooperating with God and receiving His gifts as a result. Any other thoughts? All right, let's read then the rest of the chapter, verse 7 to 14.
For they sow the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. The standing grain has no heads, it shall yield no flour. If it were to yield, strangers would devour it. Israel is swallowed up. Already they are among the nations. as a useless vessel. For they have gone up to Assyria, a wild donkey wandering alone. Ephraim has hired lovers. Though they hire allies among the nations, I will soon gather them up, and the king and princes shall soon writhe because of the tribute. Because Ephraim has multiplied altars for sinning, they have become to him altars for sinning. Altars, yeah. When I write to him for my laws by the 10,000s, they would be regarded as a strange thing. As for my sacrificial offerings, they sacrifice meat and eat it, but the Lord does not accept them. Now he will remember their iniquity and punish their sins, and they shall return to Egypt. For Israel has forgotten his maker and built palaces, and Judah has multiplied fortified cities. So I will send a fire upon his cities, and it shall devour her strongholds.
All right, so this is a very popular quoted section of scripture. You know, the sow the wind, you will reap the whirlwind. It has a very similar feel to, for example, Proverbs 22:8, where it says, "Whoever sows injustice will reap calamity." And even when St. Paul's talking to the Galatians, he says, "Do not be deceived; God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap." That's Galatians 6, verse 7. So the calamity that is coming is the natural outcome of what has been done previously. So what then does it mean to sow the wind? It probably means something along the lines of just simple nothingness. It has the same feel as another proverb: whoever troubles his own household will inherit the wind. That's Proverbs 11, verse 29. The idea then is, look, if you cause trouble in your house, if the whole household is brought to ruin, what's left for you to inherit? The wind? Like, are you gonna like, oh yeah, I have the wind right here. Like this is what the will says that I get, you know. So Israel sows nothing, or really nothing good, nothing substantial that sticks around. The wind just kind of goes off. And so they're completely infertile. They reap the judgment of the whirlwind as a result. And saying like the grain has no heads. Once again, the most popular idols at this time are the fertility gods, the Asher and the Baal. They're supposed to provide bountiful harvests, but this harvest that is being talked about here is going to be a disaster. It's going to be the disaster is going to be so complete that, well, first it's going to be a huge famine. They're not going to be able to grow enough food, but even that food that they are able to scrape out of the ground, well, someone is going to come in and take it from them. Their enemies are just going to take anything that's left. We have from Theodora of Moswetia. I always mispronounce this. Anyways, Theodora says, idolatry does not differ at all from those sprouts which dried up and destroyed by the warm wind were entirely unfit for man's food. For on the one hand, ruin and destruction succeed these. On the other side, they are useless to men, for they are unable to provide sustenance. And so then it says that, so Israel is swallowed up. This word swallow is the same word as in the previous verse, to devour. So their grain and everything will be devoured, and Israel itself then is going to be devoured by their enemies. And this is both north and south are going to be devoured eventually. They were meant, Israel in its totality, the Hebrew people were meant to be distinct from the people around them. They were meant to stand out. They were supposed to be the ones giving worship to the true God and to be an example to everyone. The God who, created them and established them, sends a savior not just for a particular people, but for the whole world and all of its people. But Israel forfeits that distinctiveness when she embraces idolatry and the nations surrounding her. As a result, the ancient Hebrews ended up looking just and acting just like the people around them. And so they became a useless vessel because there's nothing particular or unique about them. They were meant to hold the life-giving word that would refresh the nations. But if you toss out the word, well, they have nothing left inside them that makes them different from any of the other dead pots around them. Does the church in our day, are there any parts of it that resemble a useless vessel? The church, I mean,
Oh,
like
like
just out there
the
in the
royal
world,
church.
or any particular part of it. Like we could ask, is our church a useless vessel? Is the word preached
Well, I was
here?
thinking that when you read that, like, man, we gotta make sure we don't be like the old Israel.
Right.
And like, this may have been written in BC, but it applies now too.
Mhm.
And so much of, oh yeah, definitely, you see it everywhere. I think that we just have to remember to try and not get caught up in that. I think the Lutheran does. I mean, because we try to like really stick with like what's in the Bible is what we're gonna do.
Law and gospel.
Yeah, like we're just, we're not gonna make up stuff, but you see it in the Catholic Church and where things become more important than the actual words that are coming from the Bible.
It's definitely something that we have to make sure that the word of God is being preached from the pulpit. If we're not saying the words of God, then, well, why are we here? Are we here for a TED talk? Are we here for to feel good about ourselves? Are we here for do it yourself sort of get help sort of message? Self help. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to. Yeah, thank you. Self help. Is that what we're here for, or are we here to receive the words of God, the correction and the encouragement alike?
Yeah, because I think sometimes initially I might feel like, ooh, like convicted, like, but then also like that's a good reminder, and feeling that way is actually good to feel that way about like what maybe I might hear from the pulpit, and then leaving the church and doing it, not just acting it out, and because I'm in church,
right. A lot of people think Christians go to church because it makes them feel better.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, if you read scripture and you think, all right, here's the standard, but here's what we're supposed to do, and then you look at your life and see what you're actually doing, it's like, man, I really don't measure up.
Yeah.
I don't feel good about that. But we can be encouraged because we're supposed to be progressing. We're supposed to be conforming ourselves more to the life of Jesus, and taking up our cross, dying to the self. In particular, Lent, we're really focusing on this. But yeah, we're supposed. It's not a feel good message sometimes, but obviously we have hope, we have promises, we have relief from our inadequacies. So if you don't have regularly a little tinge of, ooh, like that hurts me a little bit from whatever is coming from the pulpit and from whatever we're reading, then it's like, well, nobody's perfect, so why would you think that the message would always make you feel good? It's because I'm not perfect. I know I need to conform myself more to what we're reading in here. We have to. If I don't have to change, then what's the point in Christianity? And everyone out there who has ever been a Christian has had to change because of something they've read. It's not just this book isn't for white Europeans and everyone else has to be like Europe, or it's not for people of the Middle East and everyone has to be Middle Eastern. This is a standard above whatever sort of demographics you might think of, and everybody is then conforming to this right here. So everybody, the idea that, oh, it's just a group of people inflicting a standard upon others, it's, this is God's standard that we're all trying to approach.
And I think about when I read stuff like this, I'm often like, what am I doing to further the gospel? What am I doing to do good? And a lot of times I don't. It's like, and I think some of it's that I'm trying to do this on my own.
Mhm.
I've got to change. I'm going to make all these things happen. It's like, no, that's not what you're supposed to do. It's like, wait for me to
Mhm.
help you. It's like, you're not doing this on your own. It's like, and I fall into that a lot. It's like, just in God's time, it'll happen, and it's hard sometimes for me to think that. It's like, just kind of like, just wait for things to happen. So I get hung up on that sometimes.
Yep.
It's, for a while I thought I was an elder and I wasn't visiting people. And I knew that God was mad at me, that he was angry with me, that he didn't want anything to do with me because I sinned against him. I mean, I had this in my head, and I don't know what happened. I can't, but it was like, God is not like that. He's a God of light. He's not like your dad was, or like, just falling into this. It's not your dad. This is God. So stop thinking that, it's like, so it was, and then it became real, it was a comfort to me. It was like, that's not God. That's not God. You're not worshiping that. That's,
A lot of people don't like, calling God Father because they have those sorts of issues. And it's like, no, it's missing the point. He's not just a dad. He is the ideal dad. Like whatever you wish that your dad would have been.
Yeah.
You will play catch.
So it's the like, dads are supposed to remind their kids of God, and obviously we make mistakes on that all the time. And the point is, like, look, the ways in which I fail you, God doesn't fail you. So I do a decent job, getting food on the table. He will never let you go hungry. He will refresh your soul. So you don't have to have daddy issues with God. All right. So then it goes on to describe, because of the tribute, their kings and princes shall soon be in a bunch of pain. This is again referencing the tribute of Hoshea, who was paying it to Assyria, then changed his mind and switched to Egypt. This is like the mafia extortion that we talked about last time. Paying a local big power to protect you from another local player. So, and he goes to go on to say that compares Ephraim to a donkey. There's in the Hebrew, apparently there's a very funny play on words here, because apparently the word for Ephraim and calling him a stubborn donkey, it sounds almost the same. So they're being compared. This comparison is to show them how they've strayed from God and their stubbornness in, listening to him and returning to him. It says that they buy their lovers. Welcome, John. Just a bit. Israel buys their lovers. If you think about this tribute that they're paying, it's like, oh, please be my friend, protect me, and all these things. This is it's a very transactional relationship. It's not very intimate or very deep or anything like that. This is, in fact, it's more akin to extortion than anything else. It's not really a loving relationship you got here. The implicit, unspoken suggestion here is that Yahweh isn't like this. You don't need to pay him for him to love you. He offers his love freely. and he offers that protection freely. We don't have to buy out God's protection. We could just have it by listening to him. This multiplication of altars and multiplication of sinning, one of the side effects of idolatry is once you start down, start accepting these other gods, you kind of have this anxiety that maybe you've left something out. And so, oh, well, they have a god over here, and I haven't been properly worshiping this god, so I got to add them just in case, like, I have all my bases covered. Yeah, well, that's what happened. I mean, you look at India, the millions of gods that they have, and it's like, well, obviously, if you have that many people, that many places, and that many ideas, as well, everything's going to be an idol eventually.
Miserable life to chase millions of gods.
And make all of them happy?
Yeah. Because if you make one happy, the others are going to be mad at you for It's like, seriously.
Where's the balance in that?
Yeah.
So this is something that St. Paul encountered when he went to Athens. They were so concerned with having a shrine to every god, making sure that all the gods were happy, that even they had one shrine inscribed to the unknown god. And, yeah, just in case. Like, this is to all the ones we haven't met yet. And you can find that story in Acts chapter 17, verses 22 to 34, if you want to go read that. And yeah, so it's their fear of not properly worshiping any of the multitudes of gods out there that then the opportunities to sin increase with them. And they have then obviously thousands and thousands of these altars. So God says then, were I to write my laws by the 10,000s, they would still regard it as strange. And what he's saying here isn't, if I write 10,000 laws, it's not the number of laws that he's talking about. It's the I guess the iterations of it, like how many times is he, like the number, if he wrote the 10 commandments 10,000 times and placed them in 10,000 shrines all across Israel, if you were to have, the law continually in front of their face, everywhere they look, there's a shrine to the commandments. So here's the shrine. Like, if they had that before them in the way that Deuteronomy says that they should, it says, you shall bind my commandments as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes, literally your eyelids. You're supposed to, every time you close your eyes, see the commandments of God. Even if the commandments are that common amongst his people, they still would consider it strange. They would think it would not be, this is supposed to be common among them. This is supposed to be what this people identify with, but they would still, think of it as, oh, wow, this is so weird. This is how alien, how foreign, how unlike what we want. So this is the comparison made. They have all these idols, all these altars, and they think that they're just fine, even though they should be alien to my people. But his commandments, even should he have it more numerous than these false idols, his people would consider them alien. So in that way, again, Israel deludes themselves into thinking that they are properly worshiping Yahweh and identifying with him. And they think of themselves as only having added these other gods to worship Yahweh. Like, these are just additions to the proper way of worship. This is just development. We're really just sticking to what God gave us. We're just adding a few things here or there, when really they've departed completely from what God has told them to do. And because these offerings are not offered in faith, God's promises can't be properly delivered. It says they will offer sacrifices and eat meat and eat of it. For the very poor of this time, these feasts that the Hebrews celebrated are probably the only times in the year that they got to eat meat. The rest of the year, it was bread and vegetables. So the opportunity to eat meat, you would take it. You would go to the Passover meal with your neighbor just for the fact that you could eat meat for the first time in months. So yeah, they totally would celebrate the Passover. They would celebrate all of these feasts that we see in the first 5 books, but they're really not worshiping God with it. They're really not following God when they celebrate these feasts. These are just opportunities to fill your belly, like when we were in First Corinthians chapter 11. St. Paul's talking about the Lord's Supper. That was simply an opportunity to get fed or to drink. They weren't using that opportunity to receive Jesus's body and blood. They weren't receiving that forgiveness of sins, and so it doesn't deliver the things that God promises with them because they're using it to fill themselves rather than to accept that within faith, accept the forgiveness of sins.
It's kind of like when after the feeding of the 5,000, he said you're only coming here to eat the loaves.
Exactly.
And you're
Yes.
not getting the point.
Exactly. That's it. Yeah. So as a result of this, he's told that they are going to return to Egypt. And this is in two senses. Most obviously, well, they're going to run to Egypt for help. They're going to go to Egypt and say, "Hey, protect me from big bad Assyria." But secondly, they're going to be brought back into uh, bondage, the bondage of sin. They're going to be drawn back into slavery, and in the same way that they were slaves in Egypt. I mean, the whole point of the Exodus is, look, I am a God who releases the captives. I free you from your sin so that you can then worship rightly out in the wilderness and eventually in the promised land. I'm freeing you from this so that you can worship rightly. And because you turn back to idols, you're going to turn back to the bondage of sin as well. And once again, with down to verse 14, they have forgotten their maker. This amnesia about the important things, her creator, her laws and commandments, what they should be doing. Instead of remembering those things, they build palaces. She's settled in her earthly prosperity for her ultimate good, rather than the words and gifts of God. And Judah is mentioned once again. It's like turning is like, Judah, don't think I've forgotten about you. Every time at the end of the chapter, it's like Israel, Judah, don't think I've forgotten about you.
That's right. That's funny.
Yeah, so they're not much better, whereas Israel has their palaces, Judah has their fortresses. They think that they're impervious from their enemies. They're protected because of what they've built. But in their sitting, in their behavior, they've made an enemy of God. And that's not something you can build a fortress against. So he's going to send fire on them and devour their strongholds that they trust in. And when Nebuchadnezzar shows up, he will put Jerusalem to fire and tear down every wall and fortification that they have. Once again, he was an instrument of God's judgment upon a people who had forgotten about him. We have from Theodoret of Cyrus, on the one hand, he will teach Judah when the cities are in flames not to trust in city walls, but rather in me. On the other hand, he will teach Israel not to build shrines to demons, but rather to follow my worship according to the law. Any last thoughts or comments?
Since Nebuchadnezzar, these societies were hateful and warlike, and that their whole emphasis was getting from other people, taking. So the level of vengeance here has got to be so extreme, because these were not men of God. They were
Right.
cruel and it's horrible. So you just think about these people are aligning themselves with these societies that are not their friends.
Yep.
And I'm sure they were just waiting at some point to be like, oh, these people are coming to us. Okay.
As soon as you don't toe the line, as soon as you step out of bounds.
Yeah, that's
Yep.
it. So. Ouch.
Any other thoughts? All right, let's close in prayer then. Heavenly Father, we come to you with humble hearts, recognizing that, like Israel, we have often tempted to go our own way rather than seek your will. Forgive us, Lord, for the times we have placed our hope in idols we've built in our hearts and for forgetting you in our daily lives. Teach us to sow righteousness and not the wind, so that we may reap peace instead of destruction. Purify our worship, that we may be sincere and pleasing to you. Draw us back when we stray and remind us that the true security and blessing come only from walking in obedience to you. Thank you for your mercy, even in judgment, and for calling us back to your love. In the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Stand high again. Sheila can go over.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
I know what I'm doing.